In this video, I will be covering the history of Islam in pre-partition Indian subcontinent and will give a brief overview of different Islamic orientations and their views and how all of those orientations interacted with each other and what were their views about Pakistan and why they supported Pakistan if they did and why they were against it if they were and how Muslim modernists played a key role in all of this. And I'm going to be covering all of this through the first chapter of the book Islam in Pakistan. So after this video, you will be able to understand what was the idea of Pakistan like to the ulama of different orientations, the public and other influential figures. Whether Jinnah intended Pakistan to be an Islamic state or not will also be answered indirectly in this video. And the history of Islam in Pakistan after partition till now will be covered in the next video. So let's start. This chapter in the book has 4 sections and I will cover each of those one by one so that you can follow everything. So the first one is an Islamic mosaic which covers all the orientations. So the author says that South Asia has been home to rich traditions of learning in the Islamic foundational texts as well as law, theology and philosophy for centuries. Yet the doctrinal orientations that now dominate South Asia took their distinct form during the colonial rule, including Shiism, as it underwent significant change. Zaman starts with the traditionalist orientations and these are clustered into traditionalists because these orientations are premised on a continuity with the scholarly tradition that goes back into the formative period of Islam. One of these orientations is associated with madrasa established in 1866 in North Indian town of Deoband. This madrasa represented the idea that Muslim communities' beliefs and practices had to be reordered in light of Islamic foundational texts. So it was a reform movement, but it was more than that, as it was based on the view that a reinvigorated Muslim identity was the way to cope with the radically changed situation in which Muslims found themselves as the centuries of Muslim rule had come to an end with the mutiny of 1857. Even though ulama before colonialism maintained a distance from the ruling class, but those rulers at the end implemented Sharia and appointed qazis and other functionaries, and ulama even got benefit from their patronage. So Iran and Afghanistan escaped colonial rule. Egypt and Morocco managed to retain the trappings of Muslim rule, but India experienced the full force of colonialism. This meant the establishment of a new legal system, one that administered according to English common law. An entire culture and way of life was in peril. Deoband was a response but not revolt against colonial rule. Some of those associated with the management of Deoband were lower members of colonial bureaucracy. Loyal or not, Deoband presented an alternative to the conditions of Muslims in colonial rule, and this was articulated in religious but also socio-economic and political terms as Deobandis became active in politics in second decade of 20th century. Deobandis got patronage from an Afghan king and also from pocket Muslim princely states of Hyderabad and Bhopal, but they mainly depended on the support of ordinary members of community. The second orientation in South Asian Sunnism is associated with Ahmad Raza Khan of Bareilly, who died in 1921. Bareilwis had their own madrasas, but they are best known for Sufi and other devotional practices centered on shrines and persons of holy men. The Prophet is not deemed merely to be a source of normative teachings, but a living presence. They are in some ways the most traditionalist orientations to emerge, as it represented in many cases a new name for a complex of long-standing devotional and customary practices. Deoband, on the other hand, distinguished itself from existing practices, but they too made claims to the continuity with the past, and a key figure in this was Shah Waliullah, who died in 1762, and he was seen as a cultural crucial link in the onward transmission of religious learning, as the authenticity and authority of the text depended on a chain of identifiable human links going back all the way to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The least traditional of Sunni orientations is that of Ahl Hadith or Salafism. They reject the authority of all school of law, madhahib. They view taqleed, which is investing with authority or following the legal rulings of earlier scholars or of the school of law, as investing fallible humans with the authority that belongs to God and Prophet only. They insist on the purity of the belief that replicates that of Islam's first generation Salaf and on a direct recourse to the Islamic foundational texts. But they do not lack their authoritative figures from the past as well. Shah Waliullah argued in the favor of his ijtihad, which is derivation of new legal rulings in the light of the foundational texts, and Salafis see him as an important figure in their genealogy. Earlier scholars and commentators of Hadith are also important for them. The Shia of colonial India reveal notable similarities with their Sunni rivals. The most numerous of the Shia are Isna Asharis, 12ers, who believe in 12 divinely appointed imams, and the last of these imams is believed to have gone into occultation in the 9th century and is awaited as the promised Mahdi or Messiah. Shia comprised a minority in South Asia. Shia madrasas had begun to be established in UP and elsewhere with the organizational features similar to those of Sunnis. Learning was more standardized in Shia and Sunni madrasas. An All India Shia conference began to be held annually from 1907, and this institution had a role in shaping a distinct Shia identity in colonial colonial India. Apart from all the unsettling effects, the colonial rule served to kindle a new intellectual and religious vitality in traditionalist circles, and a great deal of it came from the need to respond to vital questions about the future of Muslims under colonial rule. Muslim traditionalists might lament that the British were out to destroy their law and culture, but this challenge itself gave a new vigor to the traditionalists. Some scholars praised the British colonial rule as it allowed freedom, and much of this was due to the fact that the hostility of colonial powers carried heavy costs, but also because British did not directly interfere with the quote-unquote religious sphere. But the very definition of sphere as religious shaped it in distinctive ways. Like in the context of judicial administration, the Sharia meant only laws of personal status. So the British reshaped Islamic law to its core. Some Muslim voices were suspicious of it, like Akbar Allahabadi, who said that friends celebrate our government, under which you can say, I am the truth, that is God, but not be hanged for it. And Allama Muhammad Iqbal is also mentioned in the book. In this colonial time, technology facilitated a lot of things. The railway station helped the scholars to reach a wider audience, like Jamaat Ali Shah, who died in 1951, a Sufi master belonging to the Naqshbandi order, traveled to visit his disciples all across the Indian subcontinent. It was not unusual for Sufi sheikhs to be mobile, but the degree of his itineracy was striking. So, of course, the technology of print extended the reach and influence of scholars. Scholars belonging to different religious orientations wrote books, commentaries, letters, etc., and even the autodidacts could challenge the authority of the ulama through the technology of print. But the revival could not have been produced without the priorly existing religious and scholarly tradition. The Syrian scholar Rashid Riza said that Indian ulama had kept the study of hadith alive, while it had weakened in places like Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and the Hijaz. Deobandis and Ahle Hadith, and even Shii madrasas, which are long known for the focus of philosophy and theology, gave prominent place to hadith scholarship. The study of rationalist sciences like logic and philosophy also continued, and some Sufi orders also saw a revival. So now we can see that the Muslim modernists, as breaking from this tradition of the ulama which we have discussed so far, they were part of the same culture that their contemporary ulama inhabited. So here are some key modernist figures in colonial India. Sayyid Ahmad Khan, who died in 1898, was the pioneering modernist and established Muhammadan Anglo-Oriental College, or Aligarh College, in Aligarh in UP, as he thought that Muslims could only cope with colonial rule through an English schooling. He belonged to a family that was devoted to the descendants of Shah Wali Allah and the circle of Shah Ghulam Ali, a Sufi master in Delhi. He translated Alchemy of Happiness at the idea of Haji Imdad Allah, who was a Sufi of Chishti order and prominent figure in the genealogy of the founders of Deoband Madrasa. Second is Mahdi Ali Khan, died in 1907, better known as Muhsin ul Mulk, ally of Sayyid Ahmad Khan, was a born Shia but later became a Sunni. He had traditional learning and is famous for his biography of Sayyid Ahmad Khan, but the biography that earned him greater respect is that of the Persian poet and moralist Saadi. Third is Dipti Nazir Ahmad, who served as a trustee of the Aligarh College, and he is remembered as the author of the Urdu novel that sought to instruct Muslims in how to navigate their lives in the colonial times. He also published Urdu translation of the Quran and a major work, Al-Hukuk wal-Faraiz, Rights and Duties. This work was meant to be a code of conduct, Dustur al-Amal, for all. Fourth is Shibli Nomani, who died in 1914. He served as a professor of Persian and Arabic at Aligarh College for many years. He wrote full-length biography of Umar Raziallahu anh, Abbasi Caliph al-Mamun, al-Ghazali, Rumi, and Umar Khayyam. Towards the end of his life, he embarked on the biography of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but it was completed later after his death by his pupil Sayyid Suleiman Nadwi, who died in 1953. Shibli Nomani was a key figure in founding of Nadwat al-Ulama in Lucknow in 1894, and a decade later, it established an educational institution that was also called Nadwat al-Ulama. The Nadwa was meant to bridge the distance between traditionalist institutions and modernist colleges. It produced many distinguished scholars, and Suleiman Nadwi was one of them. At the time of his death, Suleiman Nadwi became disciple of the traditionalist Sufi Ashraf Ali Thanvi. Sixth is Mirza Muhammad Hadi, who was a Shi'i contemporary and acquaintance of Shibli from Lucknow. He is best known for his Urdu novel written under the pen name Ruswa, the Disgraced. He translated works of Plato and Aristotle as well as some writings on psychology. Thus, that the early modernists were deeply immersed in a traditional intellectual culture should not obscure their critique of that tradition and the responses that that critique generated. Critics of Sayyid Ahmad Khan alleged that he wanted the Muslims to become English in all but their religion, and some thought that the religion of those studying at Aligarh would not be safe. But Sayyid Ahmad Khan sought to defend Islam against Orientalist criticisms, and he denied that Quran really spoke of any supernatural or miraculous occurrences, and he denied some other things too. Underlying all this was his fierce opposition to taqleed, and this meant a challenge to the authority of ulama. Sayyid Ahmad Khan and some of his associates wanted to produce a new theology, an antidote to the sort of doubts that Western learning would create. But from ulama's perspective, any such theology meant only to turn people away from core Islamic beliefs, and the study of Islam did not acquire more than a token taken place at Aligarh College, and one of the reasons for that was the ulama's opposition to Sayyid Ahmad Khan, the theologian, as the administration of college thought that education was more important than religious controversy. Now we go with the second section, Indian politics and the wider Muslim world. So now we are going to see how the developments in Islamic world impact on and were impacted by Islam in colonial India. The early modernists were docile in political terms. Sayyid Ahmad Khan opposed the Indian National Congress and urged Muslims to stay away from it. But it was not just a fear of antagonizing the British, but also that the Muslims would be at a disadvantage in relation to the Hindu majority in a system of representative government. He had the conviction that India was a home to diverse nations and Muslims and Hindus were not members of a single nation with shared interests. All India Muslim League was also established due to these concerns, and it was no longer whether but how Muslims should participate in emerging political system. But some at Aligarh had pro-Congress leanings, including Shibli. Nonetheless, the idea of a separate Muslim identity was a powerful one, and it found expression in the form of Muslim League. The ulama were also politically docile at first, as they had learnt the lessons from 1857 mutiny. By the early years of 20th century, however, Deoband was undergoing change in its politics. Mahmud Hassan, who died in 1920, was a much respected hadith professor at Deoband, and he summoned Ubaidullah Sindhi, who was a Sikh converted to Islam, to establish an association of Deobandis alumni. The thinking behind this remains opaque, but it was enough to cause the administrators of Deoband to expel Sindhi from the madrasa in 1913. Sindhi's venture at that time was to forge an anti-colonial alliance among Muslims of different lands in the form of pan-Islamic movement. Morocco was brought under French colonial rule in 1912, and Italy came to rule Libya shortly after World War I. So Sindhi left for Kabul, and Mahmud Hassan traveled to Makkah to assist the plan of Sindhi. But he was arrested by pro-British Sharif of Makkah and handed over to British, and they interned him on the island of Malta, while Sindhi would spend the next quarter century in exile and was only allowed to return in India in 1939. Khilafat movement was launched in India at the conclusion of World War I. The Muslims were already disturbed at the prospect of having to fight against the Ottomans in the war. And then there was the peril of security of the Muslim holy places, which were under Ottoman oversight, and the institutions of caliphate was also in danger. And for all this, the Muslims of India came together like never before. Abul Kalam Azad died in 1958, was a traditionally educated scholar, and he had become a firebrand Urdu journalist. He came to play a role in mobilizing the Muslim sentiment around the idea that the defense of the caliphate was a religious obligation upon all believers. Apart from Azad, other scholars were on call too. Mahmud Hassan gave his blessings to the Khilafat movement and to the alliance between Hindu and Muslims in their anti-colonial struggle. Abdul Bari Farangi Mahalli, the scion of a distinguished family of religious scholars from Lucknow, was also on the political scene. But the most prominent leader of the movement was the journalist Muhammad Ali, a graduate from Aligarh, and he was different from the earlier modernists in his education. His key Hindu partner in the movement was M.K. Gandhi, a lawyer who had returned from South Africa. For Gandhi, this was an opportunity to establish closer ties with the Muslim leadership against colonial rule. Now, the alliance was formed, but it did not last long. Gandhi, in his struggle against apartheid in South Africa, had been developing a politics of peaceful non-cooperation and of civil disobedience. But the anti-colonial sentiment generated due to non-cooperation movement proved difficult for their leaders to contain, and it got violent. For example, when 20 policemen were burned alive in a UP village, leading Gandhi to suspend the non-cooperation movement and call off civil disobedience movement. There were also instances of financial scandals of Khilafat funds which contributed to the weakening of the movement. The greatest setback to the movement came due to the termination of caliphate by the Turks themselves. Despite its failure, the Khilafat movement was momentous in significance. It had shown that the pan-Islamic movement could be effectively combined with Indian politics, and that Muslims and Hindus could come together in the pursuit of at least partially shared goals. It had also highlighted the authority and influence of ulama when many Muslims became willing to give up their jobs when the ulama had told them. It is the mark of the prominence of the ulama in the movement that even the English-educated Muhammad Ali and his brother became Maulana Muhammad Ali and Maulana Shaukat Ali. The movement had also shown that it was possible for the English-educated and the ulama to come together on a shared platform. No less remarkable was the spectacle of the ulama of different doctrinal orientations working together. But the limits of such cooperation were equally telling. Ahmad Raza Khan had been appalled at Hindu leaders being invited into mosques, and some prominent Deobandis shared those misgivings. Ashraf Ali Thanvi was opposed to the movement. He too found it intolerable that Gandhi and other Hindus should be invited into the mosques and that Muslims should refrain from the consumption of cow meat because no one had the authority to forbid what Islamic law deemed permitted. Thanvi also believed that Muslims were in contract with the British colonial authorities and the agitation was a breach of that contract. The concord of modernists and the ulama also did not last longer. Ulama did not thought good about the modernists and vice versa. The Khilafat movement had raised the question more forcefully of what the relationship was between pan-Islam and national belongings. For Iqbal, the idea of Islam Islam was above everything, while the Kemalists of the Turkey Republic saw no reconciliation between pan-Islam and nationalist aspirations and preferred the later. Ubaidullah Sindhi too renounced his pan-Islamist ambitions. Azad too moved away from pan-Islamism and in the direction of secular nationalism. Others seemed to wanted it both ways, as Muhammad Ali said, where God commands, I am a Muslim first, a Muslim second, and a Muslim last, and nothing but a Muslim. But where India is concerned, where the welfare of India is concerned, I am an Indian first, an Indian second, an Indian last, and nothing but an Indian. I belong to two circles of equal size, but which are not concentric. Now the third section is Islam, law, and politics in the 1930s. Many of the religious and political trends that have been discussed so far are mirrored in the ambiguities of their interrelationship in the career of Muhammad Iqbal, the single most important modernist intellectual of the late colonial India. Iqbal's early poetry reveals an attachment to the soil of the homeland, of which he considered every speck to be a deity. His ideas changed over time, and he began saying that Islam was the true homeland of Muslims. In a 1917 Persian poem, he declared that Muslims belonged to no territory but to Islam. In Javednama, he spoke through Jamaluddin Afghani to attack nationalism. Similar ideas appeared in his presidential address to the All India Muslim League in Allahabad in 1930. He said that due to Islam, Muslims of India are a nation in the modern sense of the word, but this sense of nationhood also transcended particularistic boundaries, so showing a tension between what Muhammad Ali had described as two non-concentric circles. This ambivalent relationship between Islamic universalism and territorial centralization is illustrated further by Iqbal's response to the termination of Ottoman Empire by the Kemalists. Surprisingly, Iqbal, in a lecture on Ijtihad, praised Turkey's decision as a modernist radical rethinking, and he believed that Islamic law could evolve, but he did not trust nationalism. In 1937, Hussain Ahmad Madani said the nations were defined by territory, so that the Muslims living in the subcontinent were part of the Indian nation Qawm. Iqbal disagreed and said that Muslims formed a global religious community, millat, beyond territory. Madani thought that his way of making an accommodation with Indian nationalism was truer to the spirit of Islamic universalism, as the unity of faith community millat was not undermined by the existence of territorially based composite nations. But from Iqbal's point of view, Madani was the prototype of ulama who did not understand modern ideas, in this case nationalism. While modernists usually criticize ulama for resisting change, here Iqbal is criticizing Madani for changing Islam too much. By the time of Iqbal's death in 1938, religious orientations had developed sharper distinctions than they did earlier. The Brelvis after Ahmad Raza Khan became a distinct doctrinal group. The differences between Sunnis and Shias had also become sharper. Whereas before Sunnis had participated in Muharram processions, now the processions were flashpoint for sectarian tensions, because these were the occasion when the companions of Prophet Abu Bakr and Umar Razillahu Ta'ala anhum were criticized, and the Sunnis revere these companions as second only to the Prophet in virtue and authority. So some Sunnis demanded to publicly praise Prophet's companions, and Hussain Ahmad Madani was one of the key leaders of this campaign. The Deobandis came to articulate their distinct identity for themselves, and their influence would continue to grow in colonial times. They built thousands of madrasas, and at least two of their books had acquired the status of classics already in colonial times, unlike anything produced by their rivals. One was the Urdu translation of Quran by Mahmud Hassan, and the second was Heavenly Ornaments, Bihishti Zevar by Ashraf Ali Thanvi. In the 1930s, Islamic law entered colonial politics. A serious issue were women whose husbands disappeared. According to Hanfi law, they had to wait a lifetime, leading some to leave Islam, as apostasy dissolved the marriage and then they could revert. Ashraf Ali Thanvi responded with a book in 1933 allowing to dissolve marriage after 4 years, and he said that apostasy did not dissolve marriage. This influenced the Dissolution of Muslim Marriages Act 1939. However, ulama's demand that only Muslim judges handle such cases was rejected. Modernists supported the law, like Zafrullah Khan, who was an Ahmadi. He argued that non-Muslim judges were acceptable and went further by rejecting classical rules about apostasy, dissolving marriage, and the punishment of apostasy, but for different reasons than that of traditional ulama like Ashraf Ali Thanvi. The modernists had helped the ulama get some of what they wanted, but not without leaving sour taste in their mouths. Another law was the Muslim Personal Law Shariat Application Act 1937, promoted by Jinnah and supported by the Deobandi ulama. It aimed to replace local customs with Sharia, especially to give women their inheritance rights. But under pressure, agricultural land inheritance was excluded, and ironically, this was the area where women were kept mostly deprived. Thus, the law acted as a symbol to remedy the problem of local non-Islamic customary living practices. As David Gilmartin argued that Jinnah was willing to make all necessary compromises on the bill's content as long as its Sharia-laden symbolism was retained. The ulama's response to this was mixed. Hussain Ahmad Madani clearly viewed it as a failure. There were ulama who took a different view. These kind of things show that ulama could take unpredictable and varied positions even on important Sharia-related questions. And the last section is the movement for Pakistan. The Shariat Application Act of 1937 was a success for Jinnah, but this was a difficult time for him. In the 1937 provincial elections under the Government of India Act 1935, the Muslim League performed badly, while the Congress formed governments in 8 provinces. However, Congress showed weaknesses like in Uttar Pradesh, it failed to win Muslim reserved seats while the League won 29 of 66. But instead of sharing power, Congress launched a Muslim mass contact campaign. There had long been some disconnect between the secular positions of the Congress High Command and an aggressive Hindu-inflected politics at local levels, and this became more noticeable under Congress rule, and the League portrayed it as a threat of Hindu domination. When Congress ministries resigned at the start of World War II, the League celebrated a day of deliverance, and the Muslim League first articulated its demand for Pakistan. At the Lahore session, 22nd March 1940, Jinnah declared that Muslims were not a minority but a separate nation, deserving their own homelands. The Lahore Resolution called for independent states in Muslim-majority regions of the northwest and east. This had echoes of what Iqbal had said in 1930, and Iqbal had in fact come to be informally associated in his last years with the demand for Pakistan. But the word Pakistan was coined in 1933 by Rahmat Ali. When did Jinnah himself adopt the idea of Pakistan as a separate state is a matter of considerable disagreement. Pakistani historiography sees the Lahore Resolution of 1940 as the decisive moment at which the demand for a separate state was finally articulated. A very different view is that Jinnah used the demand for Pakistan as a tactic to secure concessions from the British and the Congress for the Muslim majority provinces within a loosely confederated Indian Union. The view of seeking Pakistan merely as a bargaining tool fails to explain how Jinnah managed to inspire mass support for it, because for that the concept had to carry some substance. At the same time, it did not need to be fully defined or fixed in every detail to become increasingly attractive. What mattered most was Jinnah's ability to present a convincing case that, number one, Indian Muslims formed a separate nation, and number two, that the Muslim League alone spoke on their behalf. The first of these claims, that Indian Muslims formed a separate nation, was not hard to sell because the British system and separate electorates had already divided people by religion. Even Muslim leaders in Congress like Madani accepted Muslims were a separate religious community, though not necessarily a separate nation. The second claim, that the Muslim League alone spoke on the behalf of Muslims, was extremely contentious. Congress claimed to represent all Indians, including Muslims, and in illustration of that claim, it had elected Abul Kalam Azad to preside over the party's annual session in March 1940, but Jinnah rejected this, arguing in his Lahore speech, and he even wrote a personal letter to Azad rebuking him. The League increasingly used Islamic language as it was appealing to a religious community. Jinnah spoke of Islam as a complete social system, a complete code regulating the whole Muslim society, every department of life collectively and individually, especially in 1941 to 45 speeches. Not long after the Lahore Resolution, the UP branch of the Muslim League set up a committee to formulate a vision of what an Islamic state would look like. Its members included Sayyid Sulaiman Nadwi, Azad Subhani, Abdul Majid Daryabadi, and Sayyid Abu Alala Maududi, who founded Jamaat-e-Islami in 1941. Muhammad Ishaq Siddiqui Sandelvi Nadwi wrote The Political System of Islam, describing an Islamic state where God is sovereign and the ulama guide legislation. This utopian vision of government leaves little room for the modernists that were at the forefront of the movement for Pakistan, and it seems to leave uncertain space for autodidact intellectuals like Maududi. Still, many ulama distrusted Jinnah's westernized leadership. Maududi opposed the League, and many feared Muslims would be divided by partition, and many of their centuries-old centers of religious life would have to be left to the mercy of non-Muslims. In a speech in Kanpur in March 1941, Jinnah said, in order to liberate 7 crores of Muslims where they were in a majority, he was willing to perform the last ceremony of martyrdom if necessary and let 2 crores of Muslims be smashed. Statements like these worried scholars who valued protection of life. The religious arguments for supporting the Muslim League for Pakistan were also strong. For ulama, this might be the only chance to form an Islamic state. In 1945, pro-League Deobandis formed Jamiat al-Ulama-e-Islam under Shabir Ahmad Usmani. Like Deobandis, Barelvis and Shia were also divided on the question of Pakistan. Though Jinnah himself was a Shia, there were significant misgivings in various Shi'i circles about what it would mean for them to live in a state dominated by the Sunnis. The Muslim League put the influence of ulama like Shabir Usmani to good use. League faced many problems during 1945 to 46 elections. Many of its leaders came from Muslim minority provinces, and unlike Congress, it lacked strong grassroots networks. So, in Muslim majority provinces like Punjab, it relied on elite alliances and powerful religious propaganda. The League showed itself to represent Islamic solidarity. The demand for Pakistan was a promise to reunite disparate Muslims in a homeland of their own. Sufi shrine leaders, peers, also helped. Even the head of the shrine of Muinuddin Chishti in Ajmer supported the League, though his area would not join Pakistan. Figures like Jamaat Ali Shah praised Jinnah as a saint. These religious endorsements carried great influence. In the 1945 to 46 elections, the League achieved major victories in Punjab, Bengal, and Sindh. But dangers existed. Regional loyalties, sectionalism worried leaders, and support from the ulama also had a price. Ulama believed that they had an equal partnership and could withdraw legitimacy if the League failed failed them. This became clear during the anti-Ahmadi agitation of 1953 when scholars and peers used shrines to challenge the government. Religious excitement around Pakistan sometimes went beyond League's control. Many villagers thought that the League wanted to establish a Muslim state, and they thought that Qaid-e-Azam was some big Molvi who had long beard and was very religious. Villagers were very anxious to see him, and some even asked when jihad would begin. Overall, the late colonial period was a time of major change among South Asian Muslims. New religious groups had emerged, and these groups disagreed on how to live according to Islam, though their ideas often overlapped. Sometimes modernists worked with ulama, especially in the Khilafat movement and the Pakistan movement. After Pakistan's creation, modernists finally had the chance to shape a state according to their Islamic vision, but this also exposed weaknesses and unanswered questions about how such ideas could work in a divided society. And that is the end of this video. And in the next one, I will talk about the history of Islam in Pakistan in the same manner we talked about the history of Islam in pre-partition colonial India in this video.